My great pleasure to welcome two speakers here this afternoon. Firstly, Donny Hay of MN, and Donny joined MN as Head of Clients UK, and he's responsible for developing MN's fiduciary management business in the UK pensions market. Before that, Donny was an independent trustee at Webb Pension Trustees, and he sat on various trustee boards and subcommittees ranging in size from 35 million to 4 billion in size. Donny's got 25 years experience of investment markets, both in managing portfolios and providing investment management services. He trained as a chartered accountant and occupied various asset management positions as well. And I'm reliably informed that he is a hockey player and indeed played at international level in his youth. Is that right, Donny?
That's right.
Also on my left, I'm delighted to welcome Anthony Webb of KPMG. Anthony's the head of the Fiduciary Management Research branch at KPMG, and he provides fiduciary management oversight advice to trustees, both to small pension schemes and large pension schemes and others in between. And he's been involved in investment governance exercises and fiduciary management selection exercises and various projects like that. He's worked for a variety of pensions and investment consulting firms and qualified as an actuary in 2008. And Anthony is quite sporty as well. In his spare time, he enjoys physical exertion, and he also learns Mandarin. And I can see the connection between those two activities, I have to say. Anyway, gentlemen, it's lovely to have you with us this afternoon, and without any further ado, I will hand over to Donny to begin our speaking.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Many of you might not have heard of MN. We're owned by pension schemes. We've been around for over 65 years, working with the in-house teams of the big pension schemes that own us, but also with, as a fiduciary manager, both in Holland and in the UK for many different pension fund clients. The traditional approach to managing DB schemes really struggles to cope with the liabilities as well as the assets, and many trustees, frankly, don't have enough time to get their head around this. So I'm going to look today at what the problem is and how we might address that. As you can see from this chart, and this won't be new to many of you, the funding level of UK pension schemes has deteriorated significantly since the 124% level in 2007 to the 78% level at the end of January this year. Indeed, the pensions deficit, as defined by this PPF survey, has risen from 46 billion at the end of January 2014 to 367 billion at the end of January this year. So it's not surprising that this is causing a bit of concern. Huge deficits put a burden on trustees, the sponsor, and ultimately the beneficiaries. Markets, as you can see from this chart, are getting no less complex. Economic and market cycles seem to be getting shorter and more volatile. And to be frank, CEOs and FDs of corporate pension schemes don't have the patience for senior executives to spend a lot of time in pension fund meetings, I find, when they're not even part of that pension fund themselves. So in my mind, it's both a governance problem and a delegation problem, and I'd like to look at both sides of that. Keith Ambachsteer spoke here a couple of years ago. He's a renowned commentator on pension issues, hails from Holland, and is involved in a number of institutes. And I think this quote sums up nicely what the problem is. In effect, he's saying you need to have a proper plan, and you need to have the right knowledge and expertise to execute that plan. Indeed, failing to plan is planning to fail. And if we start with the end in mind, which is to get DB pension schemes to full funding, it's actually, whether that's on a Section 179 basis, technical provisions basis, self-sufficiency, or to buyout, it's actually a very complex and difficult task. It requires an effective plan that's executed by professionals and who are answerable to the trustees. And for me, this is about having clear lines of accountability, responsibility and ownership, and also making sure things happen. So let's look at the governance challenge more closely. This is a challenge for the trustee boards of today, those 6,000 pension schemes out there. They're surrounded by many providers. I've got 16 round the table here, and they all want a piece of them. And that makes life pretty tricky for them because this is not their day job. What they can do is delegate the investment aspects, which reduces that burden on them and allows them to focus on the more important aspects. And as you can see here, I've got a delegated agent taking responsibility from everything from the investment consultant activities round to the risk measurer. And that can all be done under one roof, whether this is an in-house team, whether this is a fiduciary manager, or a combination of both. Now, in terms of why you delegate, you also delegate to spend the governance budget more wisely. And in effect, it's a bit of an old cliche, I know, but in effect it means don't bite off more than you can chew. You delegate to improve your governance and your control over a particular area. Access to expertise and experience is very important, but so is access to independent thinking. And if all that delegation did was pull us away from industry groupthink, then I think it would be a good thing. Indeed, I'm not just talking about the trustees following each other in our market, and we've seen plenty of examples of that in the last 10 or 20 years. I'm also talking about the dominance of the big three in terms of their house views and getting some more ideas into the debate. More sophisticated strategy. It's debatable whether that means better. It should do, but I'm not always sure in practice that it does. And again, it's part of the governance challenge to get that right. And cost, of course, people do worry about costs, and most parties would worry that it might add another layer of cost, adding a delegated agent in. In our experience, it can actually reduce cost if you do it the right way. So at MN, we believe that trustees should delegate more. You can't do everything. And I'm going to discuss what you might delegate and to whom. In terms of what you might delegate, we call this the investment decision-making waterfall. There are lots of different directions you can take, and actually that's part of the problem. There's too many choices. So what can you delegate and what can't you? It starts with a funding objective, which you need to determine as a group of trustees. And then you need to agree the investment objective. That cascades down into the investment strategy and then into the detailed implementation of that strategy. If I was to put that in layman's speak, it's really what do you want to, where do you want to get to by when, what return is required to get you there, how can we best achieve that, and how can we make that process as efficient as possible. On the left-hand side, you've got the traditional model with the trustee working with his actuary and the sponsor to determine the funding objective and to agree the investment objective. He then uses as advisor the investment consultant to work out the investment strategy, and then that moves down into the areas that you can delegate below that. And it's not all about, strategy isn't all about asset allocation and the big hedging decisions. It's also about how much bandwidth you've got around the strategic asset allocation. It's also about dynamic asset allocation, counterparty risk policy, liquidity risk policy, determining what you're going to have in the asset classes that you decide to have, and a whole load of things. All these bits can be delegated and reduce the burden on you. Within the fiduciary management solution, it can vary from an off-the-shelf solution that does everything from investment strategy down, to a strategic outsourcing partnership, to co-sourcing alongside an existing in-house team, similar to what MN are doing in part for Royal Mail at the moment. We have experience at working at both ends of the spectrum, and the important thing is the delegated solution should come up with a framework that sets, executes, and monitors those sophisticated investment strategies, but while putting the trustees in control of their journey back to full funding. But what about who to delegate to? In terms of investment governance choices, it's not straightforward. Are you an ostrich with your head in the sand, or are you a meerkat up on your toes? Some trustee boards carry on doing what they've always done with similar results, and others are actively looking around for new solutions. I suppose the area that's most common to us within the UK is the use of subcommittees. And again, that's naturally authoritative. You've got your own people involved in that investment subcommittee. You'll often have, or you'll often want in our mind to have a representative from the sponsor on that subcommittee, so you've got the voice of the sponsor. But there are challenges in terms of it being a part-time role, how to bring in the right expertise. And I also see problems in my own experience of subcommittees actually working in silos. So if you've got a situation where you're chair of the investment subcommittee, you go away and do a complicated piece of work, you come back and recommend some actions to the trustee board, the danger in my mind is they end up being just a review body. They don't actually challenge you because you're the expert, you've got the authority, and I think you lose something there. So I think from the point of view of chairing these types of committees, both the main board and the investment subcommittee, you've got to think about that. In Holland, one way around that is to use lead trustees, and that might come up later as a question. In terms of the right-hand side, there's been a growth in in-house teams, and the reason given for this growth is it allows trustees to engage more closely with a trusted partner, have more regular dialogue, have more rigorous debate. It allows you to hand-build that particular solution. But as we know from experience and observing what happens, succession planning can be a challenge, and accessing specialist expertise is also difficult at times. And then in the middle, you've got the fiduciary management solution, which is full-time, a lot of expertise. It can bring to bear a lot of economies of scale, both in terms of sophistication of the offering and cost. And it's not mutually exclusive. It's not that you have to have one or the other. The fiduciary manager can work with the in-house team. It can work with the investment subcommittee. You can top and tail it. And in my mind, we had a talk this morning that I was at, talking about how do we get consolidation into an industry with 6,150 different pension schemes. I think fiduciary management is going to be that consolidator. In Holland, where our parent company is from, the consolidator is the pension regulator. He's crunched 3,000 schemes into 250. That's not going to happen here. So you need some other consolidation mechanism to bring that together. I'd like to finish off by talking about some of the myths associated with fiduciary management. It saves trustees time. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Certainly in our experience, working with clients, you're probably meeting with a subcommittee or with a small group every 6 weeks. And it's quite intense to begin with as you set up that framework and get that strategy right. But I think what it does do is it's about using the time of the trustees very differently, and it's about focusing on the right things. Trustees worry about loss of control, particularly those that are unfamiliar with fiduciary management. But in our experience, the trustees act more like a non-exec board, spending their time on the bigger issues to do with the funding level, to do with the funding ratio risk, and to do with the costs that you're actually incurring. There was a thought, certainly at the start, 4 or 5 years ago, that fiduciary management was a panacea. It would get rid of the problem. We know that that's not the case. We've seen tenders coming back to the market. And indeed, I think there was over-delegation in the early days. For us, it's about encouraging the trustees and the sponsors to work more closely together to solve problems. And it's about that accountability and making things happen. There's certainly a feeling in my mind that if an observation that if conflicts of interest are known, they're acceptable. And I don't feel that it's an interesting one. I think that the independent trustees and the lawyers worry most about the agency, asset management conflict, advice and asset management. The trustees don't seem to worry about it as much because they know it exists. They feel they don't need to take it, they've taken it into account already. And I think that's a little bit short-sighted. Anytime you want to get an external agent to do a job for you, you want to make sure that you're getting the best provider for that job and they're doing the best job possible. And that's where independent oversight and an independent advisor are critically important, and it certainly exists in all the relationships we have. And finally, there's often a feeling that the hedging decision is the remit of the sponsor. I don't think that's good enough. I think all three parties, the delegated agent, the trustees, and the sponsor need to work together to find the right sort of framework that makes the most sense for the members and the most sense for the company. And I think actually, in fact, you need to delegate more accountability to parties that you trust and you believe in. And that's particularly the case in liability management. And we've seen what movements in interest rates have done to our funding levels in recent months and in the past year. And I think there's a lot of value added to be gained by actually being nimble in this particular area. So in summary, do you have the right structure that encourages accountability? As a trustee board, do you really feel in control of the big issues? And are your governance options working effectively? I think those are the questions that you should ask yourself when you're trying to get the best possible solution for your members. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. In 2007, I went to a friend's wedding, and I was sitting next to a guy who had just graduated from university, and he was going to start a career in investment banking. And he was pretty excited about this, and he was telling me all the things that he was looking forward to doing. And then he asked me what I did as a job. Well, I'm the head of fiduciary management advice at KPMG Investment Advisory. Previously, I worked in a couple of organisations which were developing their own fiduciary management products, so I've had sort of experience on the inside and the outside of the industry. So I explained a little bit about what I did, and unusually he sort of recognised what it was, and he said, yes, UK defined benefit pension schemes, the dumb money. So as you can imagine, I was a little bit miffed, but it's kind of worth fast forwarding 1 year from that 2007, so I get to 2008, and the financial world is on its knees, caused in no small parts by investment bankers, such as my friend at the wedding. And in the same instance, they bankrupted, or nearly bankrupted, many of the firms for which they worked. So it's interesting now, we don't really hear about this idea of the dumb money anymore. And I think I'd like this to kind of frame the debate, because or the governance debate, because I think the trustee model has actually been very beneficial for UK pension schemes over the last sort of 5-10 years. And this model of ownership of decision, of responsibility on trustees has led to pension schemes avoiding the sorts of toxic assets which caused such problems in 2008. So I'd like to frame the debate by saying I think that the trustee model is a good one, I think it's beneficial. The question is, how can we make that trustee model work better? How can we improve upon it? And I'm going to focus on the idea of fiduciary management and how fiduciary management specifically can improve your governance structure. So I'm going to split this into two parts. Shouldn't be too long, you'll be pleased to hear. And the first part will be just talking about who's doing what, so who's using fiduciary management, what does the general governance overview look like, and secondly, a couple of thoughts on how to structure a fiduciary management mandate. I should have clicked that earlier, obviously. So here we go. So if we look at the UK market as a whole, we have the defined benefit pension assets, about £1,200 billion, according to the PPF Purple Book. If we look at the UK full fiduciary management assets under management, it's actually a relatively small number. So the vast majority of UK pension schemes at the moment use a traditional investment governance approach. So by full FM, what I mean is that all the assets of the pension scheme are delegated to the fiduciary manager. If you count the instances where some of the assets of a pension scheme are delegated to a fiduciary manager, which we've classified as partial FM, you get to a figure of 70 billion. So it's a large number, but still quite small in the context of the UK defined benefit assets in total. And finally, we've got the in-house team model, which is, again, there's problems with definition here, but broadly speaking, we can see that's around about £300 billion in size. But misleadingly, that's probably only about 15 schemes. Interestingly, the size of the Greece government debt is about £300 billion. So that's one easy solution there. So not many people are using it overall, but who is using it? That's the second question. Who's using fiduciary management? Who's using a traditional advice model? Well, we can split up UK pension schemes by size of mandate. So on the right-hand side, we've got schemes which are larger than 1 billion, and on the left-hand side, we've got schemes which are less than 100 million. And I'm just going to distribute all UK defined benefit pension schemes, put in one of those 5 boxes, and see what it looks like. So this is the UK defined benefit pension scheme market. Now, the interesting thing is if I overlay the fiduciary management schemes, the schemes using full fiduciary management on top of that, I get a pretty similar picture. So most of the schemes are grouped down at the smaller end, and a significant number of schemes at the larger end compared to the number of UK schemes in total. And clearly, if you're going to have an in-house model, you need a large asset size to make that cost effective. So they're all going to be grouped to the right-hand side. So I think as an industry, we've probably been a bit lazy in describing fiduciary management as a small scheme solution. So I think that's the easy way out. Actually, if you're a small scheme, fiduciary management isn't necessarily the right governance solution for you. If you're a large scheme, it's not the case that fiduciary management won't be appropriate. I think we have to approach this in a different way. So I'm going to move on now to a couple of points about fiduciary management and how we can use it, some sort of practical examples. So the first thing I want to say is that fiduciary management is an implementation method and not an investment strategy. So the first question is, what are my investment strategy and objectives? And the second question should be, well, is fiduciary management the right way of implementing those decisions? I thought I'd bring in the story here just to try and make it a bit more interesting of my old maths teacher, who was an older gentleman. He sort of defined the word avuncular, which I did have to look up before using it today. He had a huge white beard, and when he got to the age of 65, he didn't retire like most people seem to in those days, but actually took up a post in Swaziland teaching maths there. It's quite an eccentric character. But anyway, he taught me the principles of coordinate geometry. And in coordinate geometry, you sort of got your x, y coordinates, and as the way he described it, you always got to remember you've got to go along the corridor first and then climb the stairs second. And the same applies to this model here for using fiduciary management. You've got to go along the x-axis and then the y-axis to make sure he gets to the right place. If you sort of mix them up, you end up using fiduciary management the wrong way, asking the wrong question first. So the first question is, what's your investment strategy? Do you want a more passive investment strategy, a simpler set of funds? Does that coincide with your investment beliefs? Or are you actually a fan of active management? Do you want to use lots of active funds, use tactical asset allocation, and have a sophisticated or complex investment strategy? So when you've answered that question, it's only then you can say, okay, well, in order to implement that strategy which I want, which meets my objectives, do I need to use more or less delegation? And the answer to that question will be different on a scheme-by-scheme basis. So some schemes will have the trustee expertise and engagement to be able to implement quite sophisticated investment strategies, and some schemes which don't have that same engagement won't be. So I think there's a lot of overlap here between investment strategies and whether you should be using fiduciary management or not. So the key thing is it's an implementation strategy, and whether it's the appropriate implementation strategy will differ from one scheme to the next. So finally, I just want to say a few words about choosing your fiduciary management structure. So you've gone through this process, you've decided that fiduciary management is the right thing for you. You've matched it up to your investment strategy, and it's the right way to implement it. So what services should you be using? And I think the analogy I'd like to use here is one of a pizza. So we think that choosing your fiduciary management structure is a bit like buying a pizza. So stick with me. The first thing you want to do when buying a pizza is make sure you've got a very strong base. So clearly that's going to support everything else. You have a very strong base. And in the fiduciary management model, this is the operational infrastructure. So this is effectively turning your instructions or turning your ideas into the actual purchases of units in a fund, the actual swap contracts, whatever it might be. This needs to work. It needs to work really well, and it needs to work first time without any mistakes. Secondly, you've got your tomato layer, also crucial for your pizza to function. And this is what we've termed the asset allocation. So the fiduciary manager should be giving you advice or telling you, there'll be lawyers in the room who might have a view on which one it will be, on how much money to put in equities, how much money to put in property, and so on and so forth. And the final essential part of your pizza is the cheese layer. You could argue this whole analogy is fairly cheesy, but we've chosen to call this the sort of risk control layer. And what I mean by that is the mandate to manage your assets with reference to your liabilities. So the fiduciary manager should be trying to improve the funding level of your scheme. Now, everything else, in our view, every other fiduciary management service is essentially a topping, which is optional. So you can have active funds, pepperoni, tactical overlays, I'm not quite sure what that is, active hedging, definitely mushrooms, and lots of funds. So all these things here on the right-hand side, we believe to be optional to a fiduciary management service. And we think this is maybe slightly different to the view in the marketplace, which is kind of describing some of these things on the right-hand side as kind of essential or necessary for a fiduciary mandate to work. Actually, I think it's really important to recognise that these things on the right-hand side can also, as well as adding value, potentially detract from value. So you need to be certain that, first of all, you want them, and secondly, your fiduciary manager is the right one to implement them. So just to take a quick example, tactical overlays. So this is quite common to a number of fiduciary management providers. They'll offer it as a service. And what it means is saying, okay, in a 1 to 3 year time horizon, they're going to move money to assets which they think are going to do well, UK equities and so forth, and move money away from assets which are going to do poorly, or they expect to do poorly. Now, great, this is active management, but clearly this is a really difficult job, and we should recognise that. So the first thing you've got to ask yourself is do you even think it's possible? Does it kind of fit in with your investment strategy about how you want to achieve your objectives? And the second question is, does your chosen fiduciary manager actually have the expertise and the resources to be able to pull it off? So I think those are really important questions. So I want to leave you today with 3 strong images in your mind. The first one is my bearded avuncular maths teacher telling you to go along the corridor and up the stairs. So choose your investment strategy first, and secondly, decide how you're going to implement it. The second image is of Donny here as a pizza chef, sort of dressed in a white apron and a big white hat. And I want you to, when he comes out of his kitchen, I want you to reject his kind of house pizza and say, okay, well, what we want to do is go to the choose your own topping section of the menu and choose our pizza in that manner. And the final image I'd like to leave you with is of KPMG Investment Advisory and other firms like us as the Michelin guide to pizzas, helping you choose your pizzas. So on that last rather tenuous analogy, I'll say thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.